What's up, Power Painters? Taylor Payton here of TayPayArt.com and PowerPainters.org, and I am about to introduce you to another Power Painters tutorial. So today is January 26th. It is about 10 p.m. where I'm at in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I just got back from acting class. So between freelance and finishing up the Beginner Drawing Course Extended Edition, I did not have a ton of time to create new content in order to meet the upload schedule today. So thus the crappy webcam quality footage and headset again. Please don't kill me and don't unsubscribe. But yeah, I really still wanted to give you guys a ton of value. So what I've done is I took one of my favorite snippets from the last lesson of week 12 of the Beginner Drawing Course Extended Edition. That's week 12 out of 12, and it's about 24 minutes long. And I talked to you about thumbnailing and how it can really help you improve your composition, which is basically the heart of your picture making. So this lesson is going to go in depth about things like not leading people out of the picture plane and making sure that you are figuring out at least some sort of visual narrative and things of that nature. The full lesson is about an hour and 41 minutes, and that's just lesson 12. There are four more since the original beginner drawing course was created, which was only 8 weeks long. And if you want to acquire any of these, they are all available in the description box. It is released officially on February 2nd. So, like I said, it's the 26th today, and it's just going to be a matter of time. I'm glad I got all of it done, but and well, really, I'm just happy that I get to give you guys more lessons because it makes me really happy to see what you guys have done. One thing I thought of doing is hashtag Power Painters in order for me to see stuff on social media that you guys are actually making with the lessons, because that would be really great. So if you will just do me a little favor and hashtag Power Painters or tag me on social media, I'll have all the links to my social media in the description box as well. So when you create something based off one of these, I'd love to see it. I'd love to give you feedback or just say, hey, that looks awesome. And just to keep you guys, stoked and motivated to keep doing what you're doing, because we all really feed each other. It's one big, contin continuum, one big cycle. Anyway, I'm not going to keep blabbing. I really want you guys to watch the lesson, or at least the portion of the lesson. There will be some awesome takeaways from it. It's still 24 minutes long. And yeah, I will have awesomeness for you on Monday. Oh, and lastly, before I forget, thank you so much for all the love on my first ever vlog. Like I said, I know it was a little slapdash in terms of the editing and all that because I'm totally not a video dude. But hopefully they'll be better in the future as the channel continues to grow and evolve, which it can't do without you, so you have my heartfelt thanks. I will be going to bed shortly after I beat up some more freelance. So have a wonderful time watching the lesson. Hashtag Power Painters on social media, or just tag me. Like I said, stuff's in the description box. Enjoy. Alright, so as we generate these thumbnails, the idea or fundamental of composition could actually merit a whole nother course in and of itself. But what we are going to do instead is just talk about crucial aspects of composition that will sincerely kind of follow through in regards to any kind of image you'd like to make and how you can apply those at the most fundamental level. So first and foremost, we just got to create a little section, and we're going to keep our image very small. In fact, we're going to work at it at this particular uh, size right here, just because it's going to make it easy to see the whole picture that I've sanctioned off in this rectangle, and it's going to give us the best overview of how the elements are going to come into play. So in terms of the raw idea, currently I have not planned one out, and that's going to be the first and foremost thing we're going to need to do. So I'm going to just kind of mark off an approximate area where the rule of thirds would be. And the rule of thirds is a compositional tool wherein I actually missed it, but basically I was pretty close. So you can see that this is divided into 9 squares, and where the points intersect is the rule of thirds, and that's a good place as a general rule for our focal point. So I'm going to mark that focal point off and then draw something around it that's going to be interesting. So we'll do something probably figure-based, just because that's kind of the nature of the course thus far. And it doesn't have to be good. It can just be raw scribbles and ideas. Like you can do this on a bunch of post-it notes, or anything in terms of just taking a small area, a small drawing surface area, whether you mark it off in a sketchbook or you use like an index card, and just begin to generate some ideas. So already I'm seeing a lancer, simply because I started with a figure. It's kind of a bulky figure, and I know it looks incredibly raw, and I'm going for that because the fun part is going to be figuring things out if we decide to advance this into a greater sketch. So I have this potential lancer, and I figure out the shape of the lance. I'm just drawing and erasing like usual. The shape of the lance is important. For one, right now I have to be careful because it's pointing out of the picture plane, and that's something that we probably don't want in many cases. It does also fall on the rule of thirds, so there are some good things going for it and some not so good things. So it could be the secondary focal point, this being the first focal point. So if I have a figure and this is the main focal point, and he could be in sort of a readied position, just scribble that in, then I can figure out, well, maybe this lance won't work simply because it's going to point us out of the picture plane, even if it is on the other part of the rule of thirds. So what else can I do to make this an interesting image? I don't necessarily have to use the other rule of thirds over there, or a second rule of thirds, as funny as that sounds to kind of say and hear. I can just continue to refine this particular figure. And I'm not seeing a human figure here. It's, like I said, the idea is so vague, but if I wanted it to be more humanoid, I would have to definitely keep to a certain type of proportion. So this is actually a little more squat, almost dwarven, I would say. And that gives me some opportunities to just erase the legs and play with some more shapes. It's a little bit big on the picture plane and a little close to the bottom, which gives me an uncomfortable feeling just to look at this, just to try and see that, okay, well, either the feet are going to get clipped off or they're going to be right making a tangent with the picture plane. And compositionally, that's something we want to avoid. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to shrink this guy down, and already he has way more space. He's still on the rule of thirds, and things are feeling better. So I'll refrain from making anything that points outside of the picture plane. Instead, let's make something to point at him. So what could we actually create in terms of a story here? That's one thing we want to be considering, even if we weren't very clear on it initially. So maybe he has one of those like metal sort of skirts. I don't know exactly what those are called in terms of armor, but I want to have objects pointing at him compositionally that makes sense. So let's just say he's about to enter a battle, and we'll have some other figures that I will just gesture in. They will be very loose, and this will be part of the fun to figure out later as well. If we move this from just sort of a raw thumbnail to a little sketch, and they can kind of frame like they're going to attack him, maybe. And I have to think just loosely about their pose, each pose of every single figure. And he's pretty stout. He looks like he's probably going to be okay, but we don't know. He doesn't look too scared. All these things I'm trying to communicate are just giving this idea more and more manifestation. So let's say one thing pointing to him could be somebody ready to throw a javelin or something. That would be an object, or maybe they have a spear that they're going to be using and they're charging him with it. That would be one example, definitely, of an item pointing inside the picture plane as opposed to going out of it. You don't want to lead your viewer's eye out of the picture plane in most cases. That's just a good rule of thumb compositionally. And so now I feel like I have enough information in this particular image to extrapolate upon it, so I'm going to move on to the next one. In this case, why don't we do something that is relatively the same size, maybe a little wider, like kind of a movie or cinematic format. This isn't exactly cinema format, that has a particular ratio, but I'm going to make myself think it is from the get-go by using those black bars, or sort of a kind of a hacked version of those since, like I said, we don't have the exact ratio here. I'm going to start sketching another scene out. So this is sort of fantasy. Let's deviate from that because for me personally, it's really easy to go here. And if I don't have any other ideas, the shapes that I doodle are typically fantasy shapes. So let's say we're going to do something more sci-fi and maybe less figure focused, maybe more environmentally focused. So first and foremost, let's pick our rule of thirds out again, or at least approximately. And I'm going to do that right here this time. And I will just begin to start thinking with my lines. I had an image in my head flash as I was making this after I said sci-fi that gave me sort of a landing pad, maybe an outpost. I know that there's going to be something in this right sort of corner of the image that is going to allow something to rest upon it. And so, again, this is just the idea. I wouldn't normally just run with something this vague. However, I think, and when I say I wouldn't run with something this vague, what I really mean is that I am being very loose and I would have to go and find more reference in terms of this particular shape, or just keep designing the shape until it's simple enough or believable enough for me to redraw at a larger scale and still have that believability maintained. So in the rule of thirds, I'm going to go with another figure. This time, maybe could be a pilot. Yeah, we kind of did that for the last demonstration, though, one of the last demos. So instead, I'm going to do maybe a supplier. A supplier would be a pretty interesting figure to create a story around. And oftentimes, you can use the figures in your compositions to have a story generated around them. If he's on this platform here, maybe he is getting ready to either board a ship or fuel a ship. So automatically I know what my next compositional element's going to be, and I know I don't want to lead people out of the picture plane. So I'll start designing a large mass that's going to add some weight and some more narrative to this composition. And as of right now, I have images flashing in my mind, and you'll get this effect too. The reason why we're starting and keeping it so small is so we're not bogged down by too many details, and we can use those flashes because most of us haven't developed yet the ability to hold those flashes for longer, so they're not just like a really quick frame in an animation. They're more steady, and we have a better internal representation of what we're going to be doing. Much like a musician has an inner ear, an artist has an inner eye. So yeah, I'm just not digging the way the shape is coming out, so I'm going to erase that. And I'm going to keep trying until I can figure out a supply vessel. And if I were to go over it enough times and not enjoy it, then I would probably just go find reference and I would doodle a couple of ships outside of the picture plane and come back and realize that even in the beginning stages, I'm being shown something that if I want to make a powerful image, if it doesn't work small, it's not going to work big. So I would have to learn some new elements or tricks or tactics in order to make it believable, such as how to create a ship, because as you can see, it's not like drawing a figure for me. I haven't put as much time into designing them. So it'll take me several iterations to actually get this one to a point where I would feel comfortable taking it to a larger scale. So I would definitely redraw this. However, it's better merit to figure it out at this really small form rather than to blow it up prematurely and not be able to deal with it at a larger size. This is how a lot of artists run into trouble because they bite off more than they can chew. So you're going too big too fast for one, and you're also not familiar with the subject matter. So even though I said I wanted to do something sci-fi and I now have a narrative of, somebody who is probably supplying their ship or adding some format of maybe he could be carrying a cube or a crate which is a really nice shape to implement. We know our shape design, and cubes feel really solid and they fit really well in almost any setting, especially in the more 3D, sci-fi, futuristic ones. But to go back to my earlier point, I know that I have a rough shape for the ship at this point, but if I didn't dig the design, I would have to figure that element out separate. And because I'm doing a thumbnail, I'm not going to waste, 6 hours doing something that I'm not amazing at. Just creating a final image. Like, let's say I jumped into the final and I had to fight the ship that long, and maybe it takes me 20 hours to get an okay looking one, rather than spend about 6 minutes on a thumbnail, realize I need to spend an hour studying ships and do a really, really awesome ship in my final image in less than that 12-hour window and not have a huge fight about it. So at this point, I feel fairly confident that I would be able to bring this to higher levels of finish. However, I would need to definitely study the shape of the ship, maybe the landing platform. But the idea is there. I have a frame for my figure in the form of this open panel that he could be loading boxes in. And I could have another figure in the ship watching. And the ship, it's not a very pointy shape, so I'm not pointing out of the picture plane. I'm just using a shape that happens to break the picture plane. And I could, play with that a little bit more. And just because you do one idea doesn't mean you have to stick to that particular idea. I could take this idea and change the formatting and redo another thumbnail based on it, and maybe I like that better. Maybe I like the angle better. I could vary the camera angle. And a lot of what we're going to be doing in our compositions for illustration is going to be thinking of an angle that best describes the story. Now, with these two cases, I didn't really have much of a story to begin with, but I was able to derive one simply based off of a few scribbles, doodles, and speaking about it and listening to my inner eye and hearing not hearing and seeing the flashes that come up as I'm beginning to get ideas here and generating them. So that's pretty much the basic as far as rule of thirds goes, as far as creating framing elements for your figures, putting them on the rule of thirds, and they don't have to be figures, by the way. I could put like let's see, I could make a ship the focus of the image as opposed to the figure. So if I'm placing, let's keep with a similar idea. If this is like a battle submarine and there's like some turrets or something, and it's in the water. Maybe it's come up and it's going quickly to the left of the picture plane, or I'm creating dynamic motion that infers that it's going quickly to the left, so zooming this way. Then maybe the focal point is the cannons or something like that. It doesn't always have to be figure-based. It could be a really cool instrument on the vessel. And that's a really easy idea to spin off, and it'd make it more exciting if, it was firing something and maybe it hits something and all that good stuff, which is in the other, close to the other part of the rule of thirds. And it makes it seem large because it's too big for the picture plane, much like this. So the rule of thirds doesn't have to apply simply to your figures. They can apply to any focal point that you want, but you want to define that focal point, and you usually want to place it on the rule of thirds. Another way to think about this, and maybe we'll just flip the image. Rule of thirds and focal point are not mutually exclusive. However, another way to think of, let's say, an illustration, we can do sort of a crazy postery figure-based one and start with massive shapes. So we could have a circle in the middle and maybe a triangle down here. And that means that we can start to fill these two shapes and their interaction in a way that uses these as rough guidelines, much like we do with perspective or something. So if I place two shapes in the composition, a circle and a triangle, I can start to say, well, where can I fit a figure into this circle? And it doesn't have to fit it exactly. Just putting something down will give you that initial kind of burst of an idea that will allow you to continue refining that idea as long as you're working on thumbnails. And let me tell you, these can be very addictive. You could spend days just generating ideas and then have a library of them to turn to when you want to start finishing stuff and practicing your finish, which we will get into after these thumbnails. This will probably be the last one as far as this demonstration is concerned, because really to get started all you need to know is the rule of thirds, laying in shapes, placing focal points, and just making sure you don't lead people off the composition. One thing you do want to do is ensure that you're thinking vastly in terms of shape. Even though I'm doing all these in line because that's sort of my jam, I I did the other ones that you saw with a larger brush and thus painted them, and so I had to think more about shape. But even as you work in line, you want to thoroughly consider the shapes and how they're going to give off a shape language. So, for example, this is sort of a heroic figure, and he's at the apex of this triangular shape. It'd be real easy just to have him standing or floating. And the shape language that I'm thinking about here is, sort of figure based. We have that oval for the head, and the cape, which I haven't done a ton of design with yet, is just sort of flowing. Makes him seem a little more evil or bedraggled if the cape shape is tattered. But let's say I instead give him a more wholesome and fulsome shape. Now it doesn't seem to have that same effect. Maybe it's a little more moth-like or a little more graphic and clean. So shapes that are cleaner and more graphic typically give us a certain feeling versus shapes that are frayed or broken. And I think that this is a little too much cape for the composition though, so I'm going to tone it back and hide most of it behind him. Although I will maintain that sort of moth-like shape. And like I said, I don't have to figure everything out. It's just the roughest gist of what I'm going for. So there's one figure, probably sort of a heroic figure floating. I can add another figure, looking up at this one. I can turn it into a female figure pretty easily. And if they're all floating, then I can pretty much choose the angle I want and the pose I want without having to consider gravity too much. It's more about proportion and perspective in that case. So she could have a cape that maybe she just descended and it kind of swoops around, which would take some figuring out, I can already tell. One hand back here, one hand down here, leg up, other leg up. She could be looking up at the hero, the other hero guy, and if her cape is sort of a descending shape, it could lead up into him. So very similar shapes. I want her cape to be thinner though, just because that could be her style. And I'm already thinking in terms of shape design with these capes, and I didn't plan that, that's just sort of how we're rolling here. And it's starting to come together compositionally. We could have a city below. So you got to think, what shapes make up a city? Even if you're just doodling it, which in most cases you will be in a thumbnail drawing, because it's just to get the idea out. You just got to look at your everyday shapes and break them down into rudimentary forms that you can store in your mind and deploy when you want that effect. So, in a city really quickly, and we have two figures here, which seems like plenty, otherwise it might get crowded on the picture plane unless I want to merge it down and begin to scale these guys down. I'm going to change the cape shape to mirror his so that they have more of a rapport. You can tell they're together because their shapes are very similar. So automatically we associate them with one another. And I'm going to put her higher up just because I might like that better compositionally. Makes her seem more powerful because she's higher in the picture plane. They could be relatively equal, but I think in this case I want her to be floating a little bit higher. And the background cityscape, I can add other little shapes like domes and the top pointy bits of buildings like radio towers and what have you. But more or less, this is where I would kind of say, okay, well, I could use a sun shape or something to mimic the circle, or maybe the circle is just to get me to focus up here. Regardless, we're just placing things down and getting that rough idea because the next phase is the little sketch phase. So before we move on to the little sketch phase, what I'd like to do is write down a couple of the things that we talked about during this little portion because that'll make it way easier to remember than moving forward. So don't lead the viewer's eye out of the picture plane. So that's an easy one. We don't want to do that because we want to delight them with our compositions and keep them within the picture plane. Another one is to place and arrange objects to frame the focal point, which brings us to use the rule of thirds, and also shape design is integral to a good composition. So you have to think a lot about your shapes, you think a lot about your narrative, your rule of thirds, but if you just start placing objects and all these are fairly readable at this size, I could blow them up and figure out some of the other problems I would have to solve. However, just using these guideposts, I was able to generate 4 images that are distinctly different and would allow me to, create an illustration moving forward. So I'm going to take one of these and do a little sketch, and then we'll talk more about the things that we're going to be solving in terms of taking a thumbnail and turning it into a larger format piece, even if that is not quite the final piece yet.